Hey, it's George, and welcome to the Call to Adventure podcast. We're on a mission to help create happier people and a healthier planet. So let's get after it. Hello. Welcome to another episode of the Call to Adventure podcast with me, the founder of Call to Adventure, George Beasley. As you know, this pod is all about adventure and activism. And whilst we're still exploring those themes, today's episode is something a little bit different. But before we get into it, I just want to remind you that we've got some awesome trips for you to join us on before summer's out. There are still a few spaces left on scrambling and hiking in Snowdonia. Scrambling is partway between hill walking and rock climbing, but without the need for ropes and the know-how, so you get a lot of the buzz, but without the faff. There has been a recent update to social gatherings, but our trips in Wales are still good to go ahead. We've also put on an extra date for the Make Me a Mountaineer course due to its popularity. The new date is between the 1st and the 7th of Feb. You'll learn everything you need to open up the world of mountaineering, get a chance to do some ice climbing, and actually summit a mountain as well. As with all our trips now, if it can't go ahead due to COVID, you'll have the option to move to a later date, switch to a different trip, or get a full refund, no questions asked. If you're keen, head over to calltoadventure.uk to book on. That's calltoadventure.uk. But now on to today's pod. We're chatting with Nick Hayes, the author of a number of books, including The Book of Trespassing, a Sunday Times bestseller. Nick is also a talented illustrator, graphic novelist, political cartoonist, and avid countryside explorer. We talk about the controversial plan of the Conservative government to criminalise trespassing, its impact on ramblers, wild campers, protesters and the travelling community, the history of land ownership and access in England, and really questioning the best way forward in a time when we should be encouraging more people to spend more time in nature. So without further ado, enjoy today's episode with Nick Hayes. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
Let's kick off with how we connected or how I found out about the world of Nick Hayes. So a few weeks ago, I came across a petition to stop a proposal to criminalise trespassing. And initially I thought, yeah, this is definitely something that I want to support. And then I thought I should probably actually read a little bit around it to see what I'm actually supporting. And then I came across your book. Quite a few people had mentioned it and people were talking about it. And that's the Book of Trespassing. So can we just kick off with what is trespassing?
Oh, well, trespassing is the word that I would say that elite power gives to the freedom to roam the countryside. It's actually one of those rare words in the English language that carries a sort of judgment of the act along with sort of description of it, like, I guess, loitering. If you describe people as loitering outside the pub, whatever, it's going to make people think that they were hanging around with some kind of malintent. And similarly, trespass is just the way that landed property likes to call people, I guess, expressing what in Sweden or in Scotland or Estonia would simply be considered as a kind of a human right, the right to explore nature.
What's the current kind of legal status of it then? I mean, that I kind of alluded to it a little bit there. So am I right in thinking that it's a civil offence, but it's not criminal yet? If people are kind of thinking like, okay, so yeah, I've got this better idea about what trespassing is now. It's there's this whole kind of history behind it. It's not just a description. It carries this whole connotation with it as well. But most people probably don't know what happens if you get caught trespassing. So what does normally happen?
Well, so currently trespass resides in common law, which basically means that it's described as a tort, which is defined as kind of any damage caused to another party. And so at the moment, if you're trespassing on, or if you're walking on land that you don't own, this also applies to rivers and kayaking and wild swimming. If you don't own the land and you don't have the landowner's permission to be there, they have the right to kick you off the land using this sort of rather grey ground kind of definition of reasonable force. So on a day-to-day level, what's most likely to happen to you is that a landowner or their representative will confront you. It has to be said most often in quite a kind of machismo, kind of aggressive way. And if you refuse to leave the land, then they have the right to call the police. Yet still you can't be arrested unless you actually then cause a breach of the peace. However, this autumn, the Conservatives, they've been mooting it for about 10 years. It's something they desperately want to do, no doubt to shore up the base. But they're now going to criminalise trespass. Ostensibly, that is to clamp down on the travelling community, to give the police extra powers, which 3/4 of the police that responded to the survey said they neither wanted it nor needed it. And that actually this was the result of the closure of many travellers' sites that left the travellers nowhere else to be but just land that they could find. But now this criminalisation of intentional trespass will ostensibly clamp down on the travelling community, but has very serious repercussions to the rest of the, maybe you want to call it the exploration community, or the ramblers, or the climbers, or the kayakers, swimmers, paddleboarders, because actually the words in the manifesto are just simply intentional trespass. So if you can't prove that you were there by accident, then there's every chance that you'll be criminalised for, again, like I said, what in Scotland is just considered as your birthright.
Yeah, I found it a bit of a tricky one to navigate as I looked further into it. I kind of heard from reasonable people on both sides of it, some who supported it and some who didn't. A lot in the outdoor community and mountain leaders who were saying that they think it's fine and they supported it. And then a lot of other people who said that they didn't, and ramblers who were kind of on the fence or actually kind of initially refuted it and then actually said that they were kind of happy with it. Because I did see that there was some clarification from the Home Office when they said that ramblers and wild campers won't be prosecuted and it won't affect them. But I don't know how that was actually clarified, because governments have a history of kind of wedging a piece of legislation through, the kind of thin wedge type idea where they'll say that it's not supposed to be applied to lots of cases and that it's only supposed to apply here. But when there is the ability for government to apply it in a wider extent, then they often do. And government's power always expands. So did you see anything? Is there anything in there that says wild campers or people doing kind of recreational activity won't be prosecuted? Or was it just wording around that commentary from the government to say, no, you guys will be fine, even though it's not actually in the legislation?
Well, when our petition closed at about 134,000, so with any luck, we have caused this to be debated in Parliament, which is fundamentally all we wanted. The thing is, when you get past 10,000, the government are forced to send you a response. And you're right, they said ramblers and swimmers will not be targeted. But that's on the premise that these people stay within the lines, that a rambler will keep to their right of way. There's also another repercussion, just quickly on rights of way, that if a right of way has been used for 20 years, or if a footpath has been used for 20 years, and you can prove it, then it becomes a right of way. So obviously the criminalisation of trespass could now threaten the creation of new rights of way that have maybe been going in evidence for 19 years. And then all of a sudden people will basically at this stage just be completely unaware as to whether this will constitute a criminal act or not. So fundamentally, we can't be sure at the moment, but it looks, in terms of the wording that they've used, very likely that it's not just going to be the travelling community that get penalised for this. And moreover, just that sense that a criminalisation of trespass is actually going to force people further away or be less inclined to take that risk or to use that path, even if they, are not exactly sure whether it is a right of access or not. And it also applies to people that are classed as part of the travelling community, but who many of the Roma and Irish travellers wouldn't necessarily see as the core travellers, and that's kind of the van dwellers and the boat dwellers. I'm just about to move onto a boat with my girlfriend, and all up the River Thames over the past few years, more and more no mooring signs have been sort of stamped into the banks, which fundamentally means if you are just travelling from A to B and you need somewhere to stop, it's getting harder and harder to actually find a place. The police will be given powers to impound our vehicle, aka as a traveller, take away your home and leave people homeless. So if it does actually transpire that ramblers and wild swimmers and none of these groups will be affected, there's still a very strong concern that the government are basically transgressing the Equalities Act by targeting people that travel and effectively making them homeless. So even if it transpires, and we'd be very surprised if this is the case, that ramblers are fine, there's still a human rights consideration here, and one with historically some pretty stark repercussions. As soon as you start targeting the travelling community, or as they were known back in the 30s, the gypsies, you're sort of shoring up an authoritarian state that is then, historically speaking, has moved on to, I guess, to seek to control a wider part of the community.
Yeah, and it seems like generally Western governments are heading more towards that way. I don't think we're at the same extent or the same risk as a lot of places. Like the United States, for example, is becoming much more authoritarian and bringing out their National Guard to police the Black Lives Matter protests and the looting too. But that's a whole another complex issue. So looking at other governments in Europe as well, a lot of them are becoming more right-wing, or I should say, moving towards more centre and then more to the right. So there's certainly something to be said about wanting to protect civil liberties in a time where things aren't looking quite as rosy as they have been in the past. And another kind of impact of the petition that you mentioned was the right to protest as well. So can you talk a little bit about that as well, how it might impact the right to protest?
It's trespass with an intent to reside is how the bill has been proposed. And so that would affect any of the anti-fracking communities that actually won their battles against quadrilla and stopped fracking up in Preston, for example. That would just not have been possible were the police able to remove protesters who wanted to spend, more than 5 minutes on the side of a road making their point. The protesters against HS2 will be affected. Certainly what they're looking to do with Extinction Rebellion, the police have come down a lot harder on them this time round with the third rebellion. So unfortunately, we're as sort of in the fog as everyone else about exactly what they're trying to do. But obviously, what we wanted to do was actually cause a debate in Parliament so that we could shine some light on what the government are proposing and basically force their hand to actually be more explicit, because the way they have it now is just entirely open and it's anyone's guess as to exactly where it will actually land. Just on a more nuanced point, this idea that actually not knowing whether you're going to be a criminal if you overstep the line in the countryside, at the moment, access to nature or being outside or exercising for most people in England is just about a holiday. It's about as exoticized and orientalized as it possibly can be. And as I guess the health crisis in England is proving, that's just not enough. The government needs to be encouraging people towards nature and not criminalizing it.
I couldn't agree more. We recently wrote a piece called Is the Outdoors for Everyone? And there's been a lot of controversy recently with lockdown. A lot more people were going. A few places saw a massive rise in the number of people visiting, like Snowdonia, for example, and more people trying wild camping. And I think on the whole, it was really good. I mean, more people getting outside is great, but there were a case of a few bad apples. And I think you will always get that. But I think it was blown massively out of proportion. And there's a few different problems and parties within it. There's the kind of outdoor elitists who don't like anybody from the city coming out to what they think of as their mountain.
Yeah.
And I understand why there's some hesitancy to embrace people when they see a few examples of people who aren't acting responsibly and enjoying the outdoors as they should do. But our whole philosophy is that you should encourage more people to the outdoors for the benefits that we all know are there. The kind of health, mental health, physical health, well-being, environmental and social, all the kind of example of benefits that everybody knows are pretty concrete and clear and proven by now. But we do just need to make sure that people are better educated about how to act responsibly and kind of set a good example. And I think it's our responsibility in the outdoor industry and as authors and also people who are influential in the space to make sure that you instead embrace more people going into the countryside and kind of teach them how to do it right, as opposed to chastise everybody for a few people not doing it right.
I think the problem of lockdown was very serious indeed, because there was a kind of pub, club and kind of festival culture, basically somewhere to get high and to get off your head. And in principle, I think that's totally legit. Like, the countryside is a pretty good place to get off your head. But the problem is they were bringing with it a disposable culture that is more evident in kind of city and town pubs and clubs, but also the festivals that, all the hippies that go to Glastonbury, and I mean hippies like me, and then you see Glastonbury the day after, and it's just like someone's gone around tipping out everyone in Glastonbury's rubbish. They've just devastated the fields. So there is a general problem with kind of commodification culture, disposable culture, the fact that we don't live in a kind of cycle economy where, you can take your bottles back to the supermarket and get a quid for them or in return, such as what happens in Europe, etc. But then you look at the more systemic side of it, and people just aren't taught the countryside code, because it's not just litter. There's vandalism, there's sheep worrying, there's dogs off leashes, there's the crushing of ground nesting birds. All of these are landowners' valid concerns, and we listen to them with open ears and open hearts. But the point is, the government, we FOI'd the government on how much they'd spent since 2004 on publicising the countryside code, because it was revamped in 2004. And the answer was £2,000 a year, which is a figure so small, so negligible that, you'd think it barely pays for the printing of pamphlets, let alone their distribution. If you go to the countryside, you'll find a lot more keep out, private woodland, no trespassing signs than you will any signs kind of explaining to you exactly not just what you're expected to do in the countryside, but also why. Up in Scotland, which practices the right to roam, there's a study that shows that actually, to be honest, it's no great revelation, that people respond much better to explanations and to context and to reasons as to why a dog might have to be on a leash or this kind of thing, than they do just being told and banned outright. People fundamentally are a sort of conversational, dialogue-based, community of creatures. We need to understand why we need to treat the countryside with respect. And I guess one of the parts of this campaign that we're running, which is at rightoroam.org.uk, where we're looking to actually extend the Countryside and Rights of Way Act over woodland, over rivers, over greenbelt, and over downland.
So what do you think might be a better alternative to what they've drafted so far?
Number one, with regards to ramblers and basically communities that aren't travellers, absolutely what needs to happen, which is just like what happened in Scotland when the right to roam came in, that the concept of a right to roam is completely contingent on the sort of carrying out of the very clear and very rigid responsibilities that we have to the countryside. So you're only allowed your right to roam by the law of Scotland or Estonia or Finland if you don't break any of the rules that actually are there, not just to care for the countryside and its ecology, but also the workers and the landowners, and fundamentally to protect private space, this idea of personal sanctity. So we would want to see a right to roam extended over those 4 terrains that I previously mentioned, but only with an increase in responsibilities and kind of legislation that shores up the protection of the countryside. And actually, when Labour brought in the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, which gave us 8% to roam, largely in kind of inaccessible, moorland regions, but there are little speckles of it all around the rest of the country. Some of which, by the way, you have to trespass to get to. So there's mainly due to a lack of planning. But we'd want to see, just like happened with the Crow Act, an increase in legislation. So, for example, before the Crow Act, to accidentally step on a ground nesting bird was defined as different to intentionally doing it. After the Crow Act, the two were considered to be just as bad as each other. So what that did was kind of shore up a protection for ground nesting birds, which made people a lot more cautious. So we would want absolutely the government to endorse an extension of the Countryside and Rights of Way Act and use the momentum of that and the publicity of that to actually channel a far greater understanding of, how to act in the countryside. But in terms of the travelling community, they're used to a certain degree of bigotry or racism. That doesn't mean to say they accept it, but they're used to being the kind of outsiders for no other real reason other than there's a kind of orthodoxy in England or in Western Europe to, I guess, kind of the fixity of property. If you don't have a root, if you don't have a home, all of society is kind of slanted against you. I mean, I'm just about to, like I said, go in a boat So automatically life of like, how do I register with a GP, or how do I register for, say, an old fridge to get collected by the council if I don't have an address? This actually sort of extends much deeper into the real travelling community. And councils have just started shutting regular traveller sites that have existed sometimes for centuries, giving these people fewer and fewer places to actually reside, come to rest for, be it a couple of months or a week or whatever. And then all of a sudden, we're blaming these people for the lack of spaces that they have to reside. And if we want to live in a fair and equal and just England, which is what we're always being told that we do live in, we need to provide for the communities, for all of the communities that live alongside each other. And we're not providing for the travelling community. So we decorate that situation with stories of theft or crime or this kind of thing, which are in many cases true. There are travellers that steal. There are people that live at home that steal. The fact is that these people are being grouped together and kind of labelled by the most negative and outlier acts of the people in their community. And for some reason, even the woke community of England feels that it's for some reason more acceptable to group the travelling community together under kind of pejorative epithets in a way that they would never dream of doing with, say, other marginalised communities, whether it be migrants or people of colour. I think there's something that England really needs to look at, is why we have accepted this bigotry against the travelling community in a way that most of us would refuse to do for any other community that we can think of.
Yeah, I've not really heard as to why the travelling community is kind of the last group who are left to be marginalised, and people not really realise that that's the case.
There is a whole history behind it, which I go into in my book. You know, just the whole phrase gypsies comes from Henry VIII's Egyptian Act, where he decided to label people who were Roma, who are essentially from Rajasthan. He decided to label them Egyptians because he simply didn't know any better. And from that moment onwards, there has been a kind of projection onto the travelling community that never stops to ask for the perspective or the voice of that community, but simply only layers, I guess, kind of orthodox society's frame upon them. I'm sure you've heard a lot more complaints about the traveller community than you ever have heard a person from the traveller community even be asked about these things.
I can see why it's a difficult problem to solve. That lifestyle, I think when there's a smaller population, it makes it a lot easier for that kind of lifestyle to continue. But now, as you said, with austerity and things being closed and the kind of traditional way that the traveller communities would perhaps stay on farmers' fields for a little while, or in the, I think in your book you talk about the not cricket ground, but it's something like the kind of village green before they're moved on, and that was much more tolerated. Given that they live such a different life, what would be a good solution to the problem? Or what do you think should happen?
Fundamentally, the answer lies with the travelling community as much as it does with the wider community. We're in touch with at righttoroam.org.uk with friends, families and travellers, which is just one of the larger groups of representatives for the traveller community. But to be honest, unless we're in discussion with them about this proposed criminalisation of trespass, what strikes me as obvious examples is, you know, in dialogue with the travelling community, find out what the needs are and look at a way that councils can provide access space for camps to turn up at, you know, for the caravans to come. But other than that, which just seems like the sort of picking the lowest hanging fruit, the rest would have to be down to the underrepresented, unheard voice of the travelling community. So when we are creating, you know, our sort of preparation for the government debate, which fingers crossed will go ahead, even though some have been cancelled on the premise of COVID, we are in discussion with, you know, the kayakers, with the Ramblers, with all the vested interests that we think might be affected. But similarly, there's a spot for friends, families and travellers and any other traveller group that might want to give some advice or sort of open our minds as to their experience. really it's a fact of life and English history that should be celebrated, and for centuries was celebrated, especially in the era of kind of more itinerant work. But now there's just simply been no space accorded to this community. So in a way, is it any wonder why there's so much kind of presentable enmity between the settled and the non-settled groups? That's the role of government. That's what they're there for. They have to provide for the community of England. Instead, they've chosen to use travellers as a kind of, like I said, orthodox bigotry in order, most likely, to get us to vote or to be positive towards an act that is fundamentally going to restrict the freedoms of everyone in this country.
So something that I discovered having a look at your book was that access to 92% of land and 97% of waterways is currently banned by trespass, which is unbelievable. I would have never expected it to be that high. Can you just talk a little bit about the history of England's land ownership to give a bit of context before we go a bit deeper into where things are now and how we ended up with this state where almost everything is privately owned? Can you just dilate on that a little bit?
Way back in 1066, William of Normandy came over and conquered England in his inverted commas, which basically meant lay waste to most of the north and salt the fields and conduct a campaign that was something short of genocide. And what he did was instill kind of a new sense of what it meant to own land in England. And that was essentially exclusive access. And the reason for that lies in the word forest. Forest fundamentally has nothing to do with trees or the kind of terrain that lies within it, but forest comes from the Latin meaning outside of. So he basically created areas of England that were outside of the common law that had been practiced by the Anglo-Saxons, for time immemorial. Common law was regarding the commons was about everyone had a right to the land, so whether they used it for hunting or whether they used it for winter fuel in terms of wood or to feed their cattle or take their pigs to pannage. But in return, they had their kind of list of responsibilities that they owed to the land as well. All of that was jettisoned by William the Conqueror that basically wanted to create thousands of acres of land that were dedicated just to the production of deer. Deer are very flighty, easily startled individuals. So what he wanted was just no one inside these forests. And that's exactly what he got. And as I guess the Magna Carta saw more power divvied up to the barons, and then through the Tudor period, more power was kind of given to the mercantile class, to the lawyers, to the merchants that were coming back from the slaving estates in the Caribbean, and then into the Georgian period, the kind of East Indian colonial money that was being brought in. More and more of these common areas of common land were being privatized, either illegally or through legal acts of Parliament, which basically right up until the 1830s, the Reformation of Parliament, was just a cabal of landowners. You had to own large swathes of land to even be considered as an MP. And by buying land, you also effectively bought your MPship or your membership of Parliament. So if you look at the way that the laws of property were actually written, all the John Lockes, the Samuel Puffendorfs, the Hugo Grotiuses, the William Blackstones, not only were these men all writing under the patronage of landowners, but they were fundamentally landowners themselves and were shoring up or sort of defining a notion of property that was fundamentally based on the exclusion of the public. Locke, in his very famous two treatises, sort of goes in, basically, each of these men are trying to justify what Carroll M. Rose, a sort of a law academic, calls ownership anxiety. That is like how something commonly owned could morally, ethically become privately owned. And John Locke said something that's actually on the outset quite reasonable, that if you come to a patch of waste ground and you mix it with your effort, so you yoke up the ox and you start ploughing it kind of thing, then you sow the seeds, then you have a right to protect that land if someone else tries to come in, or at least protect the wheat or whatever you were growing. But neoliberalism and capitalism is sort of, whilst basing all of their sort of laws on private property on these two treatises, have also forgotten what was called the Lockean proviso, which was where he said as long as enough is left in commons so that people can look after themselves, that the commons were basically the welfare state that allowed the working class of England to subsist without the need for food queues or coupons and stamps and winter fuel allowances. The land just naturally gave these to people. When it was privatized, these people not only were left homeless, but were also either forced into the workhouse or forced into cities where they became, the wage slaves of industrialists.
The thing that I really like, I think where we got to in your answer was the kind of moving people off the land, and they then became dependent as they had to move to cities. And then there kind of became, well, I guess all along there has been, but one notable swell was the mass trespass of Kinder Scout, which I really liked how you opened your book with that. Can you talk a little bit about what that was?
In a way, it's kind of frustrating that something that only included 400 people and fundamentally was an incursion onto private property of no more than 50 yards. It says something about the state of private property in England that can become so lionized and so mythological. But fundamentally, Benny Rothman and a load of young worker socialists met at the Bleaklow and climbed the Kinder Pass and basically spilled onto private ground with about 12 or so gamekeepers who were well ready for them because it had been well publicized in advance. And a scuffle broke out, and 6 of them, including Benny Rothman, were imprisoned. And the reason that they did that was because for the last 100 years, these moors had been enclosed by the Duke of Devonshire. And 100 years before that, they were called King's Land. They were just free to roam for anyone that wanted to take the open air. By this stage, however, Benny Rothman and all of his mates were very much, day-to-day working in the industrial cities of Leeds or Manchester or Sheffield. And it was very popular. It was about this time that youth hostels were created. It was very popular to go for walks. But at that stage, certainly the almost 40 square miles around the Bleaklow area, there were only a couple of paths, and some of those paths were only open for one day a year. So when those paths were open, just like we've seen during post-lockdown at Bournemouth Beach or, Victoria Park or whatever, these places were heaving with people. And so the reason, if we're honest, it's quite hard to put into words, but the reason that a lot of us go to nature is for space, is for the kind of psychological and physical sensation you get by being almost entirely on your own, by being elated by just being you in a space full of wildness. And they were getting none of this. So they decided there were actually a few trespasses before it that are much lesser known and a few afterwards, which were much larger and again lesser known. But for some reason, this one small trespass, they only got about 50 yards until they were clomped over the head with keepers' sticks and, began a kind of a fight. I don't know why it's entered this kind of mythology of England in such a way. And a lot of the people, a lot of the Ramblers Society, etc., will say that actually this is just a kind of nonsense legend, that the work done to create any sort of right to roam or the opening up of the national parks in 1949, all of that was down to the work of James Bryce, who was a politician in the late 1800s, or Octavia Hill and William Ruskin and, again in the 1890s, these kind of, radical artists that campaigned for more space for working class people. And Octavia Hill went on to found the National Trust. But to be honest, there's something, as I say in my book, there's something about a legend that what it really does is pierce the logic of private property. We needed those they're basically just kind of youths. They were just like 16-year-old kids that decided to meet up. The landowning community and the radical rambling community both resented them bitterly for what they'd done, because for the rambling community, they'd set back the campaign 20 years. They'd done this disastrous, like XR stopping, the tubes going down in Canning Town or wherever it was. That by making this protest, a lot of the old guard of the rambling community thought they'd actually harmed the campaign. But for some reason, still, 100 years later, almost, it's become this kind of keystone in land rights history. And to be honest, 400 isn't that many people. So it's the ambition of our campaign to completely smash that. Not that we'll get into the legend books quite as sort of emphatically, but that was a time, a place, and a zeitgeist. But we will definitely be conducting targeted mass trespasses on land that best tells the story of how unfair it is that the larger community are banned from land simply to protect the interests of very often a distant landlord that doesn't actually use the land at all.
So for your book, you kind of detail some of these walks and trespasses that you've done. Can you talk a little bit about one or two of those? Because it's not just like you're kind of observing from the sidelines and writing about the history of it and then kind of sitting in your armchair. You're actually kind of going out there and experiencing what it is that many of us believe we all should be able to do to explore a lot of that land that we're currently not able to. So can you talk a bit about your experiences? Actually, it is kind of trespassing, but I think of it more as kind of exploring.
I mean, the whole point of the book, the kind of, surprise final chapter reveal, I'm very happy to reveal now, is that every single trespass that I did in the book was in accordance with the Scottish right to roam. So had I done all of the trespasses in Scotland, it would not have been called the Book of Trespass. It would have simply been called the Book of Walking and Enjoying Yourself in the Countryside. And I guess the whole framework of this book is just to examine why in England, what is considered a crime is actually in Scotland considered your birthright. But the place that I decided to go to illustrate this fact that actually the culture of England was cut away by the privatization of land, which left no place for people to actually express themselves and to form their own kind of community, because to do it, you had to basically pay for the venue. So I went to Wilderness Festival, which is christened Poshstock by the press because David Cameron goes there, Mark Carney goes there, Richard Gere was there the year that I did it. Just as a punter, this is it's a very, very luxurious, very well produced festival, and I've got nothing against the festival itself, but the point is that 100 years ago, before it was enclosed by the Duke of Marlborough, there was a festival of 50,000 people that lasted for about, 50 years. That was just a free festival. Apparently it was a picnic of Mormons that first started it off, and more people came, and it was a celebration of local culture. But the moment that Winston Churchill's granddad bought the land, he promised that the festival could continue for 1 year longer. But even that was a lie. He basically dug trenches around the forest. This is in Cornbury in Oxfordshire. And this kind of gathering of people, like from all across the local districts, was cancelled from the calendar. 120 years later, you can still go and rave in that same field, but you have to pay £200 for the privilege and up to £10,000 to rent a twee painted faux gypsy caravan to spend the night in. It's just emblematic for me that just this sort of sense of enjoying nature, of being part of it, of sort of enveloping yourself under the night sky, camping out, whatever it is that that sort of engages you with nature, is only acceptable in the kind of leisure industry of England's relationship to nature if you've paid for it in some kind of way. And one of the most threatening things about walking is that you don't have to pay for it. Likewise, kayaking, which, enrages the owners of the rivers simply because they rent the exclusive rights to kind of occupy that river to the fishermen. And then you get a wild swimmer or a kayaker coming through and no one's charged them for that. I buy a license from the British Canoeing Organisation, but like the majority of that money goes to the upkeep of the river. So that's money well spent. And why not have a kind of licensing scheme that protects the environment that you enjoy? But the idea that I haven't paid any landowner for the privilege of swimming in a river is fine by me, because rivers offer us so much mental and physical health that so many people are connected or within easy distance of rivers. Just to use them as one example, a friend of mine, Lucy Jones, who wrote the book Losing Eden, which is about how nature impacts on our mental health, was turfed off little spot on the River Loddon in Hampshire. And she'd been going to this spot for about 6 years, had a relationship with this spot. And the fishing bailiff came along and said, "You've got absolutely no right to be here. Don't come back." And she did a bit of research, and that fishing club owns or rents off the landowners about 5.5 miles of that stretch of river that is basically the stretch that runs to and near Basingstoke. The fishing club is comprised of 80 people, most of whom don't even live in England. But the 110,000 people in Basingstoke who might want a swim or a kayak are all entirely banned from that river, just simply on the logic that if you haven't paid for it, then you don't deserve it. And obviously it goes without saying, there's a massive class issue here. You know, people that don't have the money just don't have the opportunity to enjoy nature the same way that people that can pay for it do.
I think wild swimming is incredibly special. There's something almost, it doesn't feel, naughty isn't quite the word, but it's almost like there's a little bit of mystique to it. When I was back home in Shropshire during lockdown, one of my favourite things to do was just to go down to the local river and just take a dip. And I love it because it requires no equipment. You literally don't need anything. Just whip your clothes off. Even if you just got your boxers on, then you're good to go. And there's something about that feeling of freedom that really connects you in a way to nature that few other things do that I've experienced. Wild camping is definitely another one, and also something free. And yeah, arguably you need a bit more stuff for it. But there's a feeling that you get with those things that I think you don't with a lot of other stuff. Perhaps hiking you do, but I love the fact that it's just a buttoned down, almost pure interaction with nature. And you really develop this different appreciation for the things that are around you when you're exploring by water. Roger Deacon's book is really, really good on this, Waterlogged. And there's a couple of other great books that really encourage you to kind of explore your local area. And even though I grew up in Shropshire, seeing places by the wild swimming and just kind of swimming around just gave me such a different perspective on them.
Well, Roger Deacon calls it the frog's eye view, doesn't he? He calls it,
yeah.
And there's definitely something to be said for experiencing a river valley from, 3 millimeters above the lip of the water. Before I got into this trespass malarkey, I think I'd only ever seen one kingfisher in my life. Like, I've been visiting the River Loddon quite a lot, largely because of Lucy's story, and it kind of outrages me that it's not an open river. And actually further on, the Duke of Wellington owns another 7.5 miles of that river. And just every time I'm on the River Loddon, I stop counting the kingfishers. They're just the most prosaic, boring miracle that you could come across. And there is something that it's very hard to put into words, but I think our bodies, everyone listening to this podcast, we'll just know that our bodies feel something out in nature that is profoundly healing and profoundly worthwhile. And however you want to decide it or define it, we need it. This isn't just leisure. It's not just recreation. There's something, if you want to call it more spiritual, or if you just want to be more pragmatic and just talk about its effects to the, physiognomy of your body, it's there. It really happens. We just need to reframe the way we look at nature as a kind of natural health service. That's exactly how it was presented in when the Clement Attlee government were kind of preparing the kind of, I guess, the package that they were going to offer the British people following the war. And they were drawing up the National Health Service and the welfare state, state pensions, that kind of thing. Right to roam was on the list. They were discussing it. They were talking about right to roam as a kind of sister right to the right to free healthcare. They kind of very logically thought, if we give people the right to roam, then we can prevent many of the diseases and illnesses. So provide people the ability to prevent the need for a cure. And of all the countries that I can think of in kind of the Western world, England is the most extreme. Even in America and Australia, whose laws are based on our fundamental common laws, allow right of access to rivers because they see it as a fundamental human right. The real harm and the damage of trespass is not to the landowner at all. It's to the society that is fenced out of it and the resultant, mental and physical health crises that have developed as a result of that.
Yeah, I would love to see something like they have here in Sweden, like allemansrätten, and it's a constitutional right. So it's kind of explicitly laid out, and it's similar to Scotland's right to roam, but I think might even go a little bit further. But a bit like you said earlier, it's only granted based on responsible action whilst you're there, but you're allowed to wild camp and move freely on private land other than gardens and near houses or cultivated land. But you can pick wildflowers, mushrooms, berries, and kind of, camp anywhere as long as it's non-motorized for a couple of nights. But it's all based on do not disturb and do not destroy. And I would love to see something like that back home.
Austria, that I've got very close links with, also has just this sort of much deeper orthodoxy of going out into nature. On Boxing Day in Austria, everyone's got their skis in the boot and they're all going to the mountains. It's just something that you do. And England used to, like the literature of England, the poetry, the films and the art is a landscape-based, sort of dialogue that we have with the land through arts. But actually, we've now this sort of green and pleasant land that sort of forms the basis of our kind of national mythos is actually just a lie. There's really no connection that is encouraged by the government. And what you say about the allemansrätter is so true, because like Sweden even advertised every person's right, as it's translated, on Airbnb. It was like a sort of move of the Sweden, it's a great advertising move of the Swedish Tourist Board. But you click on the Swedish Tourist Board, their description of it, and they basically say, we don't have Big Ben, we don't have the Eiffel Tower, we don't have the Leaning Tower of Pisa or David or any of these great national monuments. Our national monument is the legislated right for people to enjoy our countryside. Big Ben can fall as far as I'm concerned if we had a sort of legislated public right, government encouraged way of enjoying nature with, like you say, the sort of fundamental responsibilities that come with it. I genuinely think not only would the health of a nation be improved, but there's also something to be said. Going out into nature kind of gets us out of our own bubble. You come across people in the woods or on the rivers that you would never come across in normal life, because these natural places are a natural common ground. I've had long conversations with there was one guy on the River Loddon again who, instantly saw me. He was like, you're all Black Lives Matter, aren't you? I think he probably saw my haircut, or I don't really know what he basically saw me as a snowflake. And I was like, well, yeah, I do believe in the fundamental right of everyone to, express themselves and to live their lives as they please, blah, 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 blah. But because we were out in nature, because it was a nice hot summer's day, because the kingfishers were, whirring around our heads, neither of us were in a particularly combative mood. And we ended up having one of those conversations that I seem to have an awful lot out in the country, with people that are fundamentally opposed to me in a kind of through a prism of tribal politics. But actually there's enough around you, or actually what's around you is so neutral in terms of partisan politics. There's no Labour signs, or there's no, big Union Jacks, or there's nothing to kind of define the right way of thinking in the countryside. So actually you end up having discussions with people that are much more illuminating. You're able to listen to other people because simply you're able to come across and to meet other people. So I have this kind of, in my most manic highs about considering the possibility of an English right to roam. I really do think that there could be an aspect to it that actually goes some way to healing the scars caused by Brexit.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. There's something about where you are in the city that means you're with a kind of self-selected group. Whether you're at work, you're around people like you, whether you're a brickie or a lawyer. Whereas when you're out in nature, it kind of should be open to everyone and everyone's there. So it gives this kind of multiplicity and diversity of views and connection and people. So yeah, I'm all on board. If people are listening and they're thinking, this sounds great, I want to get behind this cause, what are some practical steps that they can do to help forward that?
Well, number one, we would love you to sign up to our website, rightoroam.org.uk. It's not just a kind of campaigning website. It's where the kind of history of a right to roam, or the kind of history of the philosophy of it is kind of, there's lots of writing on it there and lots of videos and things to engage people. But fundamentally, yeah, if you were to give us your email address, then we would basically try to engage you, and to whatever level that you would want to. We'd want you to be part of the steering groups that are talking to farmers and landowners. We'd want you to opt into the kind of how we solve the litter problem. We've got some really good, solid ideas that we're working with pre-established charities to actually look into, actually how can we guarantee to a landowner that a greater right of access from the public will result in a cleaner and more healthy countryside. In one way, all of this sounds so radical, but in another way, all you've got to do is change the way people approach these things. And I think lockdown has proven that with a bit of government messaging behind something, you are able to change the way people think about stuff. And it's going to be easier because we're not going to be restricting people's freedom to move. We're going to be increasing people's freedom to move. We're encouraging people to engage with the natural world in a way that I think suits people's minds and bodies, and so they'll be more inclined to it. So we'd really like people to get involved, and we want the mountain bikers to represent mountain biking. We want the kayakers and the paddle boarders to remember or to represent paddle sports. We're also looking to reach out to other groups of people, like religious people, like what do religious people think about the countryside? People of colour who are massively underrepresented in the demographic of the countryside. What are the other boundaries? It's not just the brick walls and the barbed wire that are preventing people of colour from coming to the countryside. It's this kind of more fuzzy notion that black kind of means urban. And I go into my book about this guy called Brian Trumay that had to step down from producing Midsummer Murders because he'd said we don't want any black people in our program because it just wouldn't be English. And there is a kind of orthodoxy that the English countryside means white. This issue of right to roam and the health properties that it can offer to people, it touches so many different sectors of society, and it's our job to make sure that everyone's heard. And that includes landowners. If there's farmers and landowners that are listening to that, I would urge them just to sort of pause this kind of orthodox assumption that we're these kind of mad Marxist radicals that are running around the countryside without a care in the world for the working factory order of the countryside and the incredible work that farmers put in, to helping England. Like, these people should be valorized alongside surgeons and nurses and doctors. That they do such incredible work for England. We would urge them just to sort of actually listen to us and maybe not, sort of buy this idea that we're just kind of either metropolitan city types with a sort of naive lack of understanding of how the countryside works, or this kind of utopian vision that, if we just ask people not to litter, they won't. That's not true. We've got real bog standard pragmatic solutions and suggestions. One of the next steps that we're going to take is to reach out to landowners, and we want to hear their perspective, because we think that this thing is really going to happen. And for it to happen and for everyone to be happy with it happening, we need everyone's voice included in the discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if change is going to happen, then exactly like you say, you need to include all the stakeholders and make sure that everybody's on board. So, Nick, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to delve into these issues and to think a bit more about them. The history is fascinating behind how we ended up in the place that we are now. But I think, like you say, if everybody gets involved in the conversation, then we can hopefully move forward to a place where we all have greater access and all the health benefits that go along with that. I think we in the tourism industry have a responsibility to make sure that we're educating people to travel responsibly. And that is certainly, I am all for the kind of self-guided micro-adventure free trip type stuff. I think that's amazing. I would prefer people do that than to not go out at all. But I do think that one of the benefits of going out with a kind of guide or somebody who spent a long time in the countryside, if you're not familiar with it, is that you can learn how to move through the countryside and cause as little damage as possible. I mean, you certainly don't need it. You can learn all that stuff from books and from on YouTube and from our free articles as well. Most people who come along are kind of either doing something a little bit sketchy like mountaineering, or they just like the idea of going with a group. But upskilling yourself and learning about how to move through the countryside is definitely something that I think should be on everyone's agenda if you're planning to spend more time in the outdoors, which is basically what we're all about.
100%, yeah.
You're also a fantastic illustrator. So if people want to see more of your work, the kind of personal you, where should they head to?
Yeah, I'm at Nick Hayes Illustration on Instagram and something like that on Twitter. But there's all my stuff on the Right to Roam website as well. I would prefer people go to the Right to Roam website because all of these words and all of these drawings are fine in and of themselves. But really, for me and my friends on this campaign, it's action that really counts. And we really want to change the way it is in this situation in England, and going to our website will definitely be the first step.
If you want to kick you off and get you inspired, I think the illustrations are amazing, and the Book of Trespassing is really very well written and tied together, and that might pique your interest, and then hopefully you'll feel ready to get involved. So thanks everybody for listening, and Nick, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really great to chat it through with you.
Until next time, bye-bye. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Head over to Call to Adventure, that's TO, calltoadventure.uk for show notes and more about this episode. You'll also find lots of other free content there. Things like how-to guides and gear reviews, everything to get you out on your next adventure. We've also got loads of adventures for you to join us on in the UK and abroad. We've got things like climbing, hiking, mountaineering, surfing, wild swimming, ski touring, and we're adding new ones all the time, so do take a peek. Each booking helps us fund our green mission, and all international trips are carbon offset. Please do rate and review the show if you're enjoying it. It helps get more people engaged with the outdoors and on board with protecting wild places. Thanks for listening. See you next time.